Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. I am Jacob Shapiro. Paternity leave is not over, but I had a speaking engagement that I had committed to before I even knew that my wife was pregnant in Moscow, Idaho, which is lovely, by the way. I've really loved my time here. So I'm here doing a speaking gig, and I thought, why not wake up at the crack of dawn and do a podcast with Rob before I go to my speaking event? Because so much is going on in the world, and you guys probably miss our banter back and forth. Apologies in advance if my thoughts are not as organized as they usually are. As you can probably imagine, I'm all over the place. But we did want to give you some thoughts about markets, about Syria, France, South Korea, some of the other things that are happening in the world. We also make a plug for CI Club in the conversation. But again, if you want to talk more about that, we're just about to close the application period. You can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want any more information about that or anything else. Otherwise, I think that's about it. I'm going to go put on a tie and give the speech. Cheers, and see you out there. All right, listeners, we are back at it. I'm traveling today. I'm doing a speaking gig that was booked before I even knew that Megan was pregnant, and I'm a man of my words, so I'm fulfilling my obligations. So here I am in Moscow, Idaho, not Russia, Moscow, Idaho. I assume you're just chilling in Paris as usual, Rob.
I am. I thought you were going to do a little joke about I'm in Moscow, Assad has fallen and I'm getting right to the heart of it, but missed
Yeah, I
opportunities.
maybe. I don't need the Russian trolls being like, "Oh, is he in Moscow? We need to hack this guy and figure out what's going on." I think I've done my time. I did not have a chance to do really my micro geopolitics treatment for Moscow, but I really want to come back because it's a lovely town. I'm at a Best Western Plus, and boy, it's more of a plus than a Best Western. I've been in some Best Westerns that are, Best Western minus. This is a Best Western Plus, Rob. And it is literally right across. I can walk to the University of Idaho, which is Idaho's land grant university, a huge ag science place. I've stopped in and I needed to buy a flash drive in their store. It was lovely. It was next to one of the weirdest looking and most beautiful Catholic churches I've ever seen in my entire life. I went to downtown Moscow and like had dinner, and it was like farm to table and Neapolitan pizza and ice cream and stuff. Like, it's very nice. The only downside is, boy, it takes forever to get here, and the sun goes down at like 3:30 during this time of year. So what can you do? But, anyway, we could check in on markets, we could check in on geopolitics. I have been in paternity leave and plan to return to paternity leave as soon as I finish the speaking gig and trek all the way back to New Orleans today. So I am really up to date on 3-week-old nap schedules and what different shades of infant poop mean and things like that. So if you really wanna get into the nitty-gritty, I'm happy to do that. But I haven't been able to be completely complacent on paternity leave because we've had Syria has fallen. The French government has fallen. The South Korean government is trying to fall, hasn't fallen yet, but we've got this wacko president who's trying to declare martial law like it's 1950 or something in South Korea. And that's just sort of the top line thing. So there's no shortage of geopolitical intrigue that we can talk about. But the listeners haven't heard from you either for a couple weeks, Rob. So why don't we talk a little bit about markets and then we can back in. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we do any of that, I'm so remiss. I'm here like wandering off right into podcast land. We wanted to talk a little bit about CI Club. We've had so many folks that have been writing in and applying to join CI Club. Rob, maybe you can tell people a little bit about the diversity of the applicants because you've been doing the hard work of interviewing most everyone.
Yes, while you're in the nitty-gritty world of poop colors, I've
Yeah.
been interviewing all the many fine applicants to the group. I guess the big takeaways would be there are a lot of fantastic people who listen to this podcast, which I sort of guessed at, but am really pleasantly surprised at the quality of applicants. I
For
mean,
the record,
really
listeners, I
great name.
always knew. Rob doubted. I always knew that you were all incredible. I'm your guy. I'm on your team.
Yeah, you people are actually pretty good. Um, so yeah, very high quality of applicants. We have a lot of people really from all over the world: Australia, Hong Kong, India, all over Europe, South America. Um, Multiple people from Texas, California, southeastern US, Midwest, farmers, engineers, chemical engineers, people running businesses, people running money. It's been a really cool group of people.
I loved Hong Kong, India, Europe, Texas. I guess Texas qualifies sort of on that route. Anyways, so we're talking about it a little bit just because We haven't quite closed things down yet, so if you wanted to apply, you can just email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. I'll get you hooked up with how to send all that information in. But we've got a great slate already, but our marketing guru said, "Hey, if you're going to do a podcast anyway, you should mention this and tell people they have sort of a last chance to get in for this round." So there you go. We did our job. We hope we did well, marketing gurus. Okay. So I was talking about there's plenty of geopolitical intrigue happening. It's also been a couple weeks since we've checked in on markets, and I haven't been keeping as close an eye on markets as I normally do. I know, unless you're living under a rock, you know that Bitcoin has gone to $100,000. I heard that. Had the usual cacophony of people in my life who never follow crypto call me and say, "Hey, what about this Bitcoin thing? Should I be buying some of that?" Also had one friend who was like, "Damn, we should have bought Bitcoin," which I've also been having that sentiment a little bit recently. But what are you seeing in markets since the last time we spoke a couple weeks ago, Rob?
Um, so the last time we spoke was right after the election, and at that time, essentially, we were seeing a replay of the Trump trade, and that we spoke about how this was misguided in many ways. Um, Essentially, what I would say is between now and then, the market is sort of waking up to recognize that fact. So if you look at a lot of the so-called Trump trade companies, so steel companies, Nucor again,
Oh,
aggregates
take a
like you
shot. Nucor. We're
Nucor.
only 5 minutes and 30 seconds in. Wow, you're really going for it.
Yep, I'm gonna pummel them every quarter until that stock is back down to $100. They're not gonna escape my ire. Um, so yeah, Nucor is starting to shit the bed again, which is a technical term that we use in the industry. Um, Companies like Martin Marietta, which make and distribute aggregates, the whole sort of infrastructure construction related complex, there seemed to be this belief that there was going to be more fiscal stimulus or something vaguely infrastructure-y, going on and vaguely growthy, and that's starting to fade from markets now. So what we're seeing now is we're still what I would call the late stages of a frenzy, and it's no coincidence that you're hearing from people saying, "Oh, what should I buy now? Oh, I should have bought Bitcoin. Maybe I'll go buy this stock instead." Like that's definitely the zeitgeist. That's a time when you want to be running the other direction. If you have any sort of long-term horizon on managing your investments and trying to zig when everyone else is zagging, everyone is very much zagging at the moment. Um, so the way that that's manifesting within markets is you saw this surge in what I can only call crappy companies, which had mostly been on the sidelines for the last few years. That's already fading pretty hard. You saw a surge in sort of cyclical construction related things. That's fading hard. And really, what you're left with is you've seen sort of a move into kind of name brand quality companies. So if you look at a stock like Walmart, if you look at Caterpillar, these are businesses that are trading at valuations that they haven't seen in Caterpillar's case ever, in Walmart's case since the 2000 bubble. So sort of names that are easily accessible that people can latch onto, that have momentum. That's what's narrowly leading the market right now, um, which tends not to resolve very well because the broader surge is already beginning to crumble. Two things that I think are really noteworthy. We've spoken a lot about NVIDIA and sort of how the AI theme has been the animating spirit of this bull market, really going back to early 2023. NVIDIA is flat since June. That's a big divergence from the market. Relative to the market, NVIDIA peaked on June 14th or June 21st, I should say. Um, this is the name that represented the frenzy and was the multi-trillion dollar kind of bellwether for all of this. If you look at less popular or more marginal semiconductor or AI related stocks, some of them are down 30-40%. So the AI story is beginning to fall apart. The market's trying to shift the narrative to the Trump story. There's really nothing there. Ultimately, you're left with no story. Um, So that's kind of where we're at. The only thing that I would point out that I think probably no one realizes unless they're actually sitting here looking at the charts is since Nvidia peaked on June 21st, everyone talks about how international markets are doomed and China's screwed. Since June 21st, when Nvidia peaked, both the Shanghai and the Hong Kong indices have outperformed the S&P 500. So I don't think anyone quite realizes that. But if you really look at the underlying dynamics of these markets, some of these things are a little bit more surprising, and you're seeing some rotation into areas that have been out of favor. So
Is that a statement more about how Chinese equities have done or more about US equities? Because I mean, there was that liftoff in Chinese equities, and we had cousin Marco on around that time, and he was talking about this huge bull market in China, and I haven't really seen that materialize. So is that more showing that Nvidia's been flat, or is that saying that China really has outperformed here over the last 2 to 3 months?
well, it's both. So it's about a shift out of what had been leading the US market, but also since June, you did see this surge in Chinese equities, but it's not, as we spoke about last time, that's old news. The surge was in September. I don't even remember when it was. September, October.
Mhm. Yeah,
I mean,
September,
we're
October.
we're months past that now, and you had sort of a blow off move that really reversed, and then everyone said, "Oh, China, they're screwed." Don't have to pay attention to that anymore. But quietly, they've been digging in, and what you see is sort of just a steady. If you were to draw a line on the chart, a trend line, it's an upwardly sloping trend line since June. With this big surge and then it pulls back, but that's what you have at the start of a new bull market. You have the initial surge that people quickly dismiss. If you were to use, Elliott wave theory, this would be wave one. And then wave two is when everyone says, oh, that's a bunch of bullshit. Basically, taking Elliott wave theory and putting it in plain English. Um, and then wave three is typically when things just chug along for quite a long time. So I don't know if that's what we're experiencing, but certainly Chinese equities are showing a resilience and a strength that is still surprising despite all the barrage of negative headlines.
Yeah. If you draw that same trend line on, say, Brent crude, it's pretty much down and to the right. I mean, it had a little comeback around October, but continues to go down too. So sort of interesting that you could have a mildly bullish Chinese chart, but that commodities would be sort of going down there. How do you connect the crypto blow off there? Is it folks are looking around for something else, or I mean, it's been a pretty huge spike here in just the last couple of weeks.
I think it's really driven by three different things. The first is that, I posted that video for us internally a few months ago. I don't even remember what it was. And I noted that, hey, Bitcoin is starting to trade more like gold in the short term, which it hasn't really done ever before. It was always trading like a small cap speculative tech stock and would move exactly like small cap speculative tech stocks. And that had not been the case for much of sort of this year from the springtime on. So I think there's an element of true safe haven demand that's been growing there, similar to what we're seeing in gold, where gold is breaking out to new highs. I mean, that's a huge move that people don't seem that interested in, which is definitely noteworthy. So there's an element of that. There's an element of pure technicals where Bitcoin had been sort of uh, consolidating within a very narrow range. You could call it a flag if you want to be, very cute about it, but essentially it broke out of that range. And a lot of people like gold, Bitcoin, you don't have much to go on. There's no fundamentals to analyze. So you have a lot of technical traders, a lot of technical trading going on. So that happened simultaneous with sort of this surge in risk appetite around the election, which helped really propel it, that next big move up. Because you saw this very obvious breakout. You had a favorable environment for that. And then I think very little at the margin. There's sort of a, hey, there's a Trump kind of backslapping effect going on where people think something good could happen for Bitcoin, even though no one seems to really know what that could be if you actually ask them for tangible explanations. It's just, let's call it vibes, our new favorite word. Um, So I think a combination of those things. I mean, generally speaking, I'm very constructive on Bitcoin, but in the short term, this is a little overheated, and very likely we'll have some kind of digestion period, to digest this next move, just like the last one.
Yeah, and speaking of digestion, we also got well, actually not I don't know, that was just something you say to try and make up a segue when you don't have a segue. But, we also had, the latest CPI print yesterday, which it's funny to watch the way that financial media covers these things because the CPI print was 2.7% year on year, a slight uptick from last month's 2.6%. The index rose 0.3% as compared to 0.2%. Core was up 3.3% for a fourth consecutive month. And yet, the headlines in financial media are this is what people expected. So rate cuts are still in line. Whereas I look at the data and I'm seeing inflation looks awfully sticky and it looks a little bit higher than what the Fed's goal is. Any thoughts about sort of inflation and the Fed going into the transfer of power to President Trump upcoming?
Yeah, it has been remarkably sticky. The inflation expectations, which no one pays attention to, but just came out, the University of Michigan expectations, uh, remain, close to new highs. Again, if you look at the median, which is what the headline number reports, but if you look at the mean, it's still off the charts. So, again, that's the key thing that I'm watching in terms of inflation, and it's probably the key thing that the Fed is secretly watching, although they'll never talk about it, guaranteed, until it's unavoidable. So that is definitely trending in the wrong direction. Um, CPI itself, again, as you point out, it has been sticky. Very important. You're getting all this despite the fact that food prices, despite the fact that energy prices are all sort of anniversarying the best numbers possible. I mean, natural gas has been year over year down significantly. We're in the $2 range again, and you can't underestimate how much natural gas just percolates out to all sorts of assets and plastics and chemicals and everything that just gets into everything else. So you've had a major tailwind, or I should say, a headwind if you're thinking of inflation, up is good. Um, that's really concerning. The other thing to really pay attention to, which I think is getting ignored by the mainstream financial press because it's a little tricky to wrap your arms around. Um, but if you pay attention to individual companies, you can see this is expectations of tariffs. So you saw two interesting things happen immediately post election. The first was you had a little bolus in the manufacturing new orders number. So it's still negative, but the new orders all of a sudden got meaningfully better. And the takeaway from that was, oh, growth times are back already. Really, I think what that is manufacturers are trying to order stuff as soon as possible to build their inventories because they expect tariffs to come. You're definitely seeing that in the consumer side. There was actually an interesting piece, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, where they spoke to some small business owners who, one guy had like a surf shop and I forget, that sort of stuff. And a lot of them were building up inventories at their stores in anticipation of tariffs to come. Now, here's the problem with this is, first of all, it sets the illusion that growth is better than it is, and people tend to anchor their expectations on that, except inventories are notoriously fickle. So you could have a very sharp decline, in the wake of this. But more important, like right as the economy is slowing, and it is slowing, which we can talk about if you want, but right as it's slowing, usually you don't want to have a big bolus of inventory build because a lot of consumer companies are going to be sitting there and they're going to be holding all this inventory. It's burning a hole in your balance sheet. And that's when you have promotional activity, you have price cuts. This is a disaster in the making for margins. So it's a real tricky situation, and it gets to the issue that we've spoken about a lot, which is that when volatility goes up, volatility of policymaking, volatility of policymakers, um, generally speaking, returns go down because it's just harder to plan. It's harder to anticipate what's going to happen and to make the right moves. And if you zig when things zag, you end up in a bad place. And that's seems to be where a lot of this is playing out.
Well, and I'll be making this point later today, and I can't remember if we made this point on the podcast before, but it's gonna be a recurring theme because a lot of what we're talking about here is also gonna be based on policy making in the White House. And you can have all the fancy models that you want in the world, but unless you're eating breakfast with President-elect Trump and you know what's in his mind, it's gonna be very, very difficult to think about what the next 3 to 6 months looks like. And I say that because he was elected because Americans were not happy with the economy, putting aside whether they were right to be happy or not. They weren't happy with the economy, and they didn't think that Kamala Harris was going to do a good job managing the economy. They thought that Donald Trump was going to do a better job managing the economy. And if you look at the menu of policies that he talked about on the campaign trail and continues to stick with so far going into the handover of power, none of these things tell me that inflation is going to come down at all. Tariffs is going to be inflationary. Like if you're going tax cuts again, like that could also be inflationary in a weird way. So you like sort of go down the list. Is he going to create an inflation spike? And to me, that raises the question: is he actually going to do it? Because, like, it's one thing to say that you're gonna do all these things and happy days are here again. It's another thing to move forward with some of those policies and then, oops, inflation goes up, and how fast does it take the electorate to turn on him? Maybe they don't turn on him at all. Maybe he has the charisma to sort of get across it. But do you have a view on, and I know it's impossible to have a view on this, but do you have a view on what the White House is thinking? Either do you think that these tariff threats and some of these other things are empty threats? And if they're not empty threats, do you think that we could see a little bit of policy whiplash if you do get, a first month or a second month of data that looks pretty harrowing from an inflation point of view?
Um, this is a very long conversation, and we just had a long conversation the last time on this, which, I don't necessarily want to go too deep down this rabbit hole. I would add sort of two observations. The first is they don't have any ideas. And I think some of the comments he's made since our last conversation have made that clear. Like some of the policies that he's spoken about, they just don't make sense. You have to use the dollar, but then
Yeah,
we want the weak in the dollar.
yeah.
Like it's just clear that it's chaos. And that shouldn't be surprising. Shouldn't be surprising at all, given what we've talked about here. This is not a party of ideas. And that's not the MO. So I think that's one takeaway. The second takeaway is specifically around inflation. As we've said in many of these conversations, going back to the original one where we just did a whole thing on tariffs, months and months ago. And then the more recent one, this is going to cause inflation for sure, despite what anyone says. And there's a lot of people who really don't know anything who are opining very loudly on this. But yeah, it's very likely to cause significant inflation. Um, I think rather than a policy whiplash where you'll see, oh, let's immediately remove them, it's some kind of negotiating ploy. I think the thing about prices and what history, economic history and policymaking history teaches us about this is prices are something that you can try to control or have the illusion of trying that you can control if you're, a president without a lot of humility. So, I mean, Nixon did this. They tried to basically put in place wage freezes and price freezes and, pursue inflationary policies and then try to go out the back door and clamp it down so that people, didn't see that in a very explicit way. I would expect something similar here, and it kind of goes with the whole bully capitalism thesis that I have adopted, which is, hey, this company raised their prices, they're bad. It's their fault. Yeah, I mean that would be a perfect playbook. Um, if you're not
Which is
trying to
which
freeze
is
them.
which is funny because that was the Kamala Harris playbook.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily even one party or another. That is, policymakers of all stripes. Like when you have inflation, that's always the temptation is to find scapegoats to try to control. Because remember, inflation is a number reported by the government. Um, you know, it's easy to mess with that. So, I'm getting a little conspiracy theory-esque here. I don't know what the word is for that, but, um, yeah, I think they're gonna go down that route, would be my expectation.
Yeah. I was also struck by, you probably saw that the US announced another tranche of semiconductor controls on China and everything related to AI. And I was actually more struck by Bill Bishop on cynicism, his great Substack. If you're not reading Cynicism and you're interested in China, you should definitely read it. I've been trying to get him on the podcast for a long time. Maybe one day his ears will tickle because he knows that I'm saying nice things about him on the podcast. Anyway, um, but he made the point that, despite the fact that there were, 140 different things and these different countries and all these different companies that are going to be affected, some people have been attributing Nvidia's doldrums to, maybe some of these semiconductor restrictions. He said it looks like the semiconductor companies managed to lobby the Biden administration on the things they needed most. Like they're still going to be able to sell to Huawei in some of these particular cases. So it's really not these companies that are going to get hit. I think over and over and over again, the way that this sort of works, it's the smaller actor, the small shop owner, the small farmer who gets hurt by some of these heavy-handed Olympian policies. But as you said, we could talk about this forever, and there's been plenty going on with geopolitics. So with the caveat that I've been knee deep in toddler land, I have been keeping up as much as I can on things. Where do you want to start, Rob? Do you want to talk a little bit about Syria? Do you want to talk about South Korea? Do you want to give us an on the ground update about what's going on in France? Are the baguettes coming out? Um,
Why
which of
don't
those
we
do you want to touch
let's move geographically from west to east. So,
Okay.
let's start with France. What do you think about latest developments?
I mean, unsurprising, we know that Macron's election gambit failed, and that meant that you were gonna have, um, a lot of policy volatility in France. It seemed like Barnier was just gonna try to sneak something through, and, like, both the right and the left were like, we're not gonna let you do that, and we don't have to let you do that anymore, so, like, try again." I will say, just from my point of view, it it's particularly bad timing because you've got a German government that is waiting for elections and is a lame duck. You've got a French government that doesn't seem able to push any policy forward. Italy's having troubles of its own. Maloney's on, better or firmer land than both France and Germany, but the big voices inside of the EU, they're just not there, and they're coming into a Trump administration that is probably going to be a little bit hostile to them. That it has its own priorities about what's going to happen with Russia, Ukraine, and is going to push Europe on that. So it just seems like a moment of political weakness at Europe at a time that Europe needs political strength. That said, these things can change quickly. Um, and maybe if Trump comes in and starts talking about tariffs and trade wars and going after Airbus again, maybe there's a rally around the EU flag again. So I'm not quite sure. How is the feeling on the ground?
Pretty calm. Um, I think there is, um, I think the mainstream sort of reaction to this has been to blow it a little bit out of proportion to the political change. I mean, and I think my essential takeaway on this, in a nutshell, is in the French context specifically. They have sort of had a stay of execution for quite a long time to the same processes that other European powers have been experiencing, which is the breakdown of the traditional right and left parties. And they had the stay of execution because Macron was such a powerful centrist figure that was able to sort of cobble together, not really a party, sort of a technocratic um, make weight, for quite a long time. And that's reaching its natural conclusion, and you're starting to see, the same sort of forces play out that you're seeing in, the places like Spain, went into, and Germany itself, to a different extent. So, I don't think it's necessarily like, "Oh my god, it's the first time in 62 years that like, who it's not a big deal." Like, that's the headline everyone's throwing around. That's really not very important. Um, there's 2 things that make me very optimistic on France regardless of everything. Um, the first one is, the Rassemblement National in France, and we spoke about this in our podcast, The Revolt of the Masses, which I would encourage people to revisit if they wanna get deep into this, but, Essentially, what I'm going to say is the RN, this is essentially the Trumpist party of France. These are the people who have no ideas. They don't even have a freaking policy website. If you go on there, it's just a bunch of like, it's like a PowerPoint with, a bunch of pictures of Jordan Bardella like looking cool. Um, and that's fine. Actually, in preparation for that earlier conversation, I printed out because I thought it was apropos the speech that the Joker gives in The Dark Knight when he's talking to Two-Face in the hospital room and he's explaining, "I am the agent of chaos. Um, I'm like a dog chasing cars. I don't know what to do if I catch one." I think that's a good speech to read to understand sort of the MO of parties like the RN or parties like, sort of the Trumpist wing, which is it's not necessarily about a certain policy platform or ideas. It's about destroying other people's ideas and just being sort of a middle finger to the Macrons of the world who are these elitist weirdos, frankly. Um, so uh, the reason why I'm positive on France in that regard more than others is that the right has been so tarred with sort of a political position that's just unacceptable in some ways that I don't think they'll ever truly enjoy power in the same way that, um, you know, Donald Trump and his wing of the party has in the US. Most likely, you're going to see in France and elsewhere sort of a acknowledgement of the increasingly mainstream view that Europe has to be for European people, in terms of heritage, that these nations are not good at assimilating immigrants, and they should really not try to be the universalist, beacon like the US is. Um, and they're already doing that essentially. So the opportunity is there for the mainstream politicians, and they already are to sort of win on that issue. And at the same time, if you look at sort of the day-to-day functioning of these systems, and especially in France, because that's the one I pay the most attention to, they just reopened Notre Dame this week. It was on time and on budget. They just did the Olympics on time and under budget, or, the expected budget, not the official budget. It's a system that seems to be working pretty well. Um, and not to get too in the weeds, but on one particular issue, which I think is illustrative, I posted this really interesting piece about the health system here and how there's really this acknowledgement that, like, hey, we need to really make hard decisions about the healthcare system because prior to COVID, deficits in the healthcare system were starting to widen. And there was this belief like, oh, it's probably just, mismanagement and inefficiencies and stuff. And that was sort of the main line, and now people are realizing that it's really not that, it's more of a structural deficit, that it's aging populations, it's wider array of treatments available to people just because of innovation and some modest price inflation. But if you put those things together, like, you just can't pay for the system. Like, the deficits are getting worse, not better, despite their best efforts. So there's a genuine political will to, like, hey, let's figure this out. And if you look at Barnier's budget, like, a lot of that was trying to find savings. It was um, a fairly conservative budget in terms of, you know, being a budget for grown-ups. And, I think that's ultimately the point I'm trying to make is, it's still the politics of grown-ups, and that's ultimately probably a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, and it seemed more like his tactic to try and get it through without a vote was what raise the ire of both sides, rather than any sort of meaningful part of the thing itself. I was going to ask if you had seen Notre Dame yet. I mean, Notre Dame was completed on time, but I also saw that the French government waived a bunch of the bureaucratic hurdles that most sort of projects like that would have had to go through so that it could be completed on time. Which sort of tells you, like, maybe we don't need all the, and this is true for the United States too. Maybe we don't need all these bureaucratic hurdles if we're trying to get things done and build new infrastructure and things like that. Driving through rural Idaho and rural Washington, by the way, you can get a sense of just how badly the United States itself needs to invest in some of its infrastructure. Um, I take your point. And maybe I'm just perpetually naive or perpetually hopeful about the European Union. But I know the narrative out there is that thing that I started with, which is it's a bad time to be weak. There's so much dissension. There's so much instability. But the German election, it's not really ambiguous what's going to happen. You're going to get a conservative, right-leaning CSU, CDU government that's going to be able to call the shots a little bit. So maybe we're going to get a stronger Germany here that's going to be able to do things. France is not necessarily going to be able to push things through itself, but they are going to get the pressures of the Trump administration, Russia. I mean, there are migration. There are things that they can do to try and capture hearts and minds from that point of view as well. So I'm not quite willing to count them out, even though I do think there are going to be some challenges going forward. And if I was Zelensky in Ukraine, I would be a little nervous, sort of, about the direction that things are going. But I haven't quite lost hope for Europe yet myself. Um, do you want to move to the Middle East now?
You mean literally? No, I'll stay here. I'm good.
Yeah, I don't want to go to the Middle East. No, I just want to. This is a good opportunity to eat some humble pie and to serve some humble pie to every geopolitical analyst out there. I know of no analyst who had the collapse of the Assad regime on their bingo card for 2024, let alone for the rest of the decade. Even all the Gulfi governments, they were normalizing Assad. They were bringing him back into the fold. They were tired of this never-ending civil war and this never-ending stalemate inside of Syria itself. And my, how quickly things have gone. You sort of have to put on your conspiracy hat a little bit here because Assad was in Moscow when some of these things started to kick off. Um, Generally speaking, the fall of the Assad regime is a really good thing for Turkey, but the rebel group that led the assault on these cities was not the one that Turkey's been backing. It's actually a former Al Qaeda affiliate that has reformed itself, that is now promising security to Russian military installations in the country and talking about trying to build some kind of transitional government. Even the United States is accepting that plan, at least initially. So you've got the United States accepting a formerly Al Qaeda group's plan for a transitional government in Syria, just like, crazy things happening all over the place. So there's some part of me that wonders, did Iran and Russia just look at their balance sheets and say, we can't afford to support this Assad guy any longer because he can't get control over the situation. He's a minority. His ethnic group is a minority group inside of Syria. Like, we're just on the wrong side here. So maybe there needs to be some kind of, deck change inside of Syria itself. Assad himself is now in Moscow, apparently, having declared asylum. So this didn't go the Gaddafi route or the Mubarak route. Like, he got out and he got his family out, which is also sort of an interesting thread there. So I'm not sure how much it actually changes from the point of view of, say, markets or even companies. But I do think it points to a longer term trend that we've been talking about for a long time, which is whether or not that rebel group that took over, even if they weren't backed by Syria or excuse me, Turkey, or weren't Turkey's primary choice to be the leader there, this is all good news for Turkey. The rise of a Sunni nationalist state inside of Syria, that's what Turkey has wanted this entire time because Turkey thinks it's going to be able to pull the levers there a little bit more, almost like the way that Iran can do this with Iraq. It's the same sort of thing that Turkey can do for Syria. And I think in the long term, that means bad things for Israel. It means bad things for Russia. It means bad things for Iran. And it means bad things if what you want is a balanced power in the region. Because the weaker that all of those different countries get, the stronger Turkey's interests are going to be in that part of the world. So that was sort of my key takeaway. But I don't know if you had questions or if there was anything you wanted to dive into a bit more there.
Can you update sort of your views on Turkey's position toward Israel? Because I know Erdogan has said a lot of stuff in recent months, especially. Has anything changed there, or just remind us sort of what the key takeaways would be?
Yeah, so to zoom out at a very high level, until the Mavi Marmara incident, which was, what was it, 2010, 2011? I can't remember exactly what it was. That was this flotilla that was supposed to go from Turkey to Gaza, and the Israelis boarded it, and some people died, or I forget if they shot it down. Anyway, that caused a diplomatic break between Turkey and Israel. And ever since then, ties have been pretty rough. There's also there's a natural, well, I'm not going to make it sound more than it is. Netanyahu and Erdogan don't like each other. They hate each other. They hate each other personally. They hate each other ideologically. They just don't like each other. And the moments where you've had a reprieve in the Turkey-Israel relationship over the last 15 years is either Netanyahu, the rare moments when Netanyahu is not in control of the government, or the United States comes in and says, guys, get over this shit and start talking to each other. Obama did this very famously, where he got Turkey and Israel together and he was like, I'm tired of this. I need you both to at least talk to each other. And there was a period where they did. There's also natural business ties between Turkey and Israel, trade, all those sorts of things. Um, so until that break, though, Turkey and Israel were relatively close. Turkey was one of the friendly countries to Israel. Turkey was part of NATO. It was part of the Western Military Alliance. It was all, old Cold War friends that had won the Cold War that were doing things together. Um, that relationship, though, as I said, it's broken down over the last 15 years. It hasn't really been repaired, despite several attempts by the United States or by other politicians in Israel to try and heal it. Attempts by the Turkish and Israeli business community to heal it. And something I heard recently from a contact of mine, I can't say who it was, mentioned that Turkish companies were starting to ask for supply chains that could be certified, that they had no that Israel didn't touch the supply chain in any way, so that they could import non-Israeli products into Turkey. And, you might say, oh, well, what does that matter? That matters because Israel does have a weird space in the tech world, of the semiconductor world, where it's doing some things where you might get some components, or you might get some software, or you might get some things that are in the Israeli market. And I sat up in my chair when I heard that Turkey was saying, we don't want to import anything that has any Israeli component in it whatsoever. Because now that's, like, the business community is either not willing to fight it, or they're just sort of waving the white flag there. You're right that he was very strident about Gaza at first. He's gone relatively quiet. And I can't help but think maybe one of the reasons he's gone quiet is that he's playing the long game here, where there was nothing he could do for Gaza, probably nothing he can do for the West Bank. But if you can flip Syria, that is a big deal, and that is a big existential threat to Israel going forward. And maybe then, if you have that lever on the board, maybe Israel will take you seriously, or maybe you're moving to a point where you can project power into the region more generally. I've said this a couple times, and I know it's controversial. It's especially controversial to pro-Israel audiences, but Israel's long-term existential threat is not Iran. It's Turkey. And the more that Turkey starts to bleed into these former Ottoman lands and becomes a power broker in some of these lands, um, the more nervous I would be for Israel. The other country that I don't think gets talked enough here, and I don't even really have my own view here yet, I'm trying to form it, is I don't know how Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries are gonna react to this. Because on the one hand, Turkey's been hard up for money, and after Erdogan's most recent election, he went to the Saudis hat in hand and said, "Please, like, give me money because all of my crazy policies with the lira means that I'm out of it, so I need it." And there is a nice symmetrical relationship there, where the Saudis, they have money and they have good relationships with the West, and maybe they'll have some fancy military tech and things like that. And the Turks have soldiers and they have manufacturing capacity and they have a really nice position in the Middle East that Saudi Arabia can work with. So is there some kind of, nascent understanding between these different countries, Israel and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, that, hey, we can all share and we're all going to do better if we're doing things together, and we can yell at each other and say not nice things and maybe not even recognize each other, but it's still better in the long run. Certainly the Trump administration, I think, is going to push that. Um, but I don't know. For me, I would be very concerned if I was an Israeli strategic decision maker about what does the relationship with Turkey look like 10 years from now and 15 years from now. What does it look like in a world where nobody cares about Iran anymore? Like, let's say that the supreme leader, after he dies, there's no successor, there's a contested election, and Iran reverts back to some kind of revolutionary period, and the Islamic Republic is no longer there. I'd be really nervous if I was Israel at that point, because now the glue that ties all this together, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the glue isn't there anymore. And Iran is a much more attractive economic partner if they don't have a crazy supreme leader on the board than Israel is. So I'm rambling a little bit, but those are some of the thoughts that I would have in mind when thinking about the long-term trajectory of that relationship.
And just one more question, zooming out. When you think about Turkey, and its long-term motivations and imperatives, how important is that region to what it's trying to do in terms of growth and power projection and just being a bigger player on the stage? Like, is Syria and, the Near East, other than historical ties and legacy, is it really that essential? Like, what do they hope to get out of that region?
Well, some of this is wrapped up in the Kurdish issue, because the Syrian Kurds have their own little quasi-independent statelet in northwest Syria, and Turkey's not going to like that. They also have their own Kurdish population, and there are pretty good relations between the Turkish Kurds and the Syria's Kurds. So if you're Turkey and you want to think about security, you want the Kurdish insurgency over, and for sure you don't want an independent Kurdish state or something that could turn into an independent Kurdish state rising on your border. That would fundamentally threaten the Turkish heartland. So there's that national security priority first and foremost. The second is, yes, the Levant is crazy, and yes, the Middle East is crazy. But it's still sort of the type of thing that Turkey needs a handle on if it's going to protect itself from that point of view. And it's also, it opens up new markets, it opens up new labor opportunities. It also opens up an opportunity for Turkey to be a leader in the Muslim world. That's what Turkey thinks of itself as a leader of the Sunni Muslim world. And you can't be a leader of the Sunni Muslim world if you're not controlling, or at least in good relations with those who are controlling the Sunni Arab heartlands. That's where it is. So if Turkey is going to present itself as, hey, we're going to have good relations with the Central Asian states because, we have historical ties there, and because we're a leader of the Muslim world, we're even going to be able to go to places like Indonesia. And because we used to be where the caliphate was, we can do all of these different things and create trade relations on a sort of Muslim political national basis. Like all of that, I think, is part of that. And the last thing is just, if you look at the history of the Middle East, there are a couple of different key strategic linchpins, but Syria is one of them. If you control that sort of Damascus to Aleppo commercial heartland, you really are in a good place to project power throughout the entire Levant. So that's Lebanon. That's even into Israel or Palestine before, all of these different areas. And these are areas that are highly commercial, that have been in various parts of their history, have been incredibly wealthy places, trading areas, places where things are going back and forth between different parts of the world. So I think there's a lot there to it. There's also with Turkey, Turkey's not only going to expand southward, it is also eventually going to expand northward. It's going to go into the Balkans. It's going to look across the Black Sea and think about some of those historical areas where it expanded before. But it has to feel secure on its southern flank before it can really consider any of those sorts of things. And so that's another reason why, if you can at least say, hey, it's not going to be crazy Islamist ISIS guys blowing things up and trying to get into Turkey, or Kurdish insurgencies, or Iran and Russia, playing with things down in this region. If we have that buttoned up, okay, now we can look north and say, let's focus on the Balkans. Let's focus on the Black Sea Basin. Let's focus on the Mediterranean and some of these places that really would help Turkey extend itself.
I know we want to get to Korea, but real quick, a stopover. We haven't spoken about the Horn of Africa for quite a while. There's been some talk about changes in recognition of Somaliland's status. Does any of this matter, or should we just pass over it and say no big deal?
I want to say we should pass over because I don't. There are not many Horn of Africa experts out there, and even when I'm on my game, I would say the Horn of Africa makes up an infinitesimal amount of my brain power. That said, it is important. Like the things that are happening in the Horn of Africa are important, and I also don't think you can disconnect the massive sort of dislocation that's happening in this region in general. If you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict on top of the Syrian civil war, on top of what's happening in Lebanon, on top of what's happening in Sudan, which is maybe the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now, on top of the Ethiopian civil war, like I don't think it's a coincidence that you have all of this massive change and massive conflict happening all relatively in the same area. And if the Horn of Africa continues to go that way, like shipping is not going to come back, and it has a whole bunch of other different uh, it's important from that point of view. I will say, and this goes back to the Israel, Syria, Turkey, Saudi relationship, and all those sorts of things. Gaza has been wiped off the board. Hezbollah has been wiped off the board. Iran is reeling. Are the Houthis next? Because if you can get the Houthis off the board too, maybe we're talking about trade starting up again. And then maybe we are talking about, oh, now it's just putting out some brush fires in the Horn of Africa, and maybe we can get back to normal shipping again. So I think the Horn of Africa is important, but I'm actually looking across the Horn more towards Yemen right now, because if if the Houthis go the way of Hezbollah and of Hamas, um, then maybe all of my pessimism about Israel's strategic position is not warranted. Like maybe everything is going just fine and everything is going according to plan. So
All right, Korea, explain what the hell is going on there. Because
yeah,
it's, yeah.
I have a pretty short take on this, which is President Yoon won by a razor thin majority. It was like 0.8% when he was elected. So he didn't have a huge mandate. Also, in the midterm elections, his party didn't do particularly well, so he was going to be stalemated anyway. Um, he declared martial law via some legal mechanism that is supposed to be saved for, like, if North Korea invades or something like that. So he treated this normal domestic political gridlock as an existential threat to the South Korean state and said, okay, like, um, it's going to be martial law and I'm going to take over. And I mean, it didn't last 24 hours. I don't know if you saw those amazing videos of the protesters out there sort of blasting K-pop, the parliament building at the soldiers and the security forces. I mean, it was just really great. And so now he's in trouble. The previous president from his party, so not Moon Jae-in, who was the previous president, but the previous president who was from Yoon's party, is in jail for corruption anyway. And an inordinate number of previous South Korean politicians have been jailed because of corruption or because they've done strange things in office. That's probably going to be the fate for Yoon himself. If anything, I thought that the story was more about the resilience of South Korean democracy because, I mean, within 24 hours it was done. Like, they had a sitting president, like, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it. Please don't hurt me," sort of thing. So I thought it was a nice resounding support for South Korean democracy. Yoon is only still president because his party didn't want to get him impeached so quickly because they want to maintain a little bit of their position. So I assume that they will boot him out eventually. They even said he's not going to be doing any governing. We're going to keep him there for now, but, like, we're not quite ready to side with the opposition and impeach him because we want to get our ducks in a row a little bit more. The one sort of big thing that I would say that I'm watching here now is, it looks like the opposition is doing well, and the opposition, when it had the presidency before Yoon, had a much more conciliatory, peaceful approach to the North Korea situation. It was much more willing to entertain economic and trade ties with China. It was less willing to be sort of completely tied into the U.S. Security alliance. That also dovetailed with the first Trump administration, and South Korea is one of President-elect Trump's favorite whipping boys. He loves to go after them, and I'm sure that he will go after them again. Yoon did some very unpopular things. He tried to bury the hatchet with Japan. He doubled down on the U.S.-South Korea security relationship. He was very, very tough on North Korea to the point where now North Korea has shut down the border. So you put all these things together, you put together his very narrow margin of political support. I wonder if this will give sort of wind to the opposition sails. And if we're going to look at a much stronger opposition government, either so elections are supposed to be in 2027. If they do impeach Yoon, which will probably happen eventually, I think it's 60 days. They have to have a new president at that point. Could you get an opposition party president in there that wants to pick a fight again with Japan, that is going to be bristly if Trump goes after them, that wants to redo some things around North Korea, and that is fundamentally more open to commercial ties and economic ties with China than the Yoon government is? I think it's a little early to say that, but those are all the things that I'm watching for because I think the political conditions are right to move there. As for the rest of it, though, I mean, it was some pretty interesting political theater, and honestly, I mean, just a big fat mistake. I don't know what Yoon was thinking. Whoever advised him to do that uh, wasn't wasn't reading wasn't reading basic polls and basic, like, election figures.
And just to tie what you just said into, action and markets and specific, um, things that we're doing, this is stuff that matters because our investment thesis generally towards South Korea has been that it's a place that can straddle multiple supply chains. So if your thesis is a multipolar one where there's going to be some level of uh, breakage of supply chains into different spheres of influence and security spheres, that's Korea can in many ways sort of straddle multiple ones, the Chinese one, the US Japan axis, and Japan is similar. So if they do have a more marketed move toward sort of a pro China policy, and if they start causing trouble with Japan again, that has real implications for Korean companies. And specifically, like a few years ago, when it appeared Korea was moving in the other direction, they deliberately cut out some very important Japanese chemicals and semiconductor suppliers that were supplying the big Korean, chip champions, and that had significant implications on the ground. So this is something to watch with real implications out there.
Yeah, arguably of all the craziness that's happened in the world geopolitically over the last week, South Korea is the most important. like what happens in Damascus, it's going to be important to the future of the balance of power, or, nerdy, wonky stuff. It's actually not going to affect most supply chains, and it's not going to affect like most markets. France, I think, is ditto. Like it was a story for a week, but I think all that stuff was already baked in. The South Korea thing is not baked in. It was also a massive surprise. And depending on which direction it goes, it could have a major impact on the South Korean economy and on the Japanese economy and even on sectors of the Chinese economy. So, um,
That's the good, measure of things is, does it make us buy or sell certain stocks because something has happened? Then that's a different level of importance.
You're joking, but it's actually one of the reasons I've enjoyed working with you and in this space, for how many years now? It's like going over 5 now, right? And in COVID years, that's like 20. Because I find one of the hardest things about geopolitical analysis is keeping yourself honest, because you can make a forecast about, the collapse of the Syrian rebels, which we did at Stratfor in 2012. We were only, 12 or 13 years, not the Syrian rebels, the collapse of the Assad regime. We were only 12, 13 years, off on our timeline there. Um, but it actually helps. It helps you be accountable and be honest when it's like, okay, something has happened, and now I'm going to do something based on this information, and I'm going to have an objective indicator of whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. So for me, it continues to supply a really important feedback tool for how I'm thinking about analysis, because you can get too far in the weeds and just be thinking about 14th century Kurdish history and Salafist blah blah blahs in the Middle East if you go too far down some of these geopolitical rabbit holes. So,
All right, back to poopy diaper land with you.
well, first I got to give a speech to these farmers and tell them what I think about the world, and then back to poopy diaper land. And you have a hard stop too. So, listeners, we'll check in soon. See you out there.